What if the very act of seeking enlightenment is what prevents you from finding it? What if the harder you chase the divine, the faster it recedes? Every spiritual tradition whispers this same secret. The Zen masters, the Sufis, the Christian mystics, separated by centuries and continents, all arrived at this same paradox, and they all pointed toward one thing: silence. Not as another technique to master, but as the one gateway the achieving mind cannot corrupt. There exists a peculiar madness at the heart of the spiritual quest. The seeker climbs the mountain, stumbling upward with desperate intensity, eyes fixed on some imagined summit where enlightenment waits like a trophy to be seized. The harder they climb, the steeper the path becomes. The more they grasp, the more their hands close around empty air. This paradox has haunted mystics across every tradition, every age, every corner of human longing. But within the paradox lives its own resolution. The ancient teachers knew something we have forgotten in our frenzy of seeking. They understood that silence holds a secret the thinking mind cannot penetrate. They recognized that in the space between breaths, in the gap between thoughts, in that pregnant void which precedes all speech and concept, there dwells something closer than effort can reach. Something breaks in the moment of spiritual awakening, but what breaks is not what the seeker expected. The accumulated practices, the years of discipline, the libraries of sacred texts absorbed, the retreats attended, the gurus consulted, all this effort collapses into a recognition so simple it borders on absurdity. You were already home. The journey was an illusion. The distance was fiction. This truth appears again and again in the testimony of mystics, yet each new generation of seekers must discover it freshly, must exhaust themselves against the same ancient wall. Spiritual growth emerges not from frantic accumulation, but from inner stillness, from surrender to what already is. The obsession with achieving spiritual goals becomes the primary obstacle to grace. The seeker's intensity, their burning desire for transformation, creates an iron shell around the very thing they seek. Consider the mechanism of this trap. The ego, sensing its own potential dissolution in genuine spiritual awakening, performs a masterful deflection. It transforms the spiritual quest into another project, another arena for its continuation. Enlightenment becomes a goal like any other, something to work toward, to measure progress against, to eventually claim as achievement. I have meditated for 10 years. I have studied with realized masters. I practice 8 hours daily. The I grows stronger, not weaker. The self expands, draped in spiritual robes, claiming humility while secretly cataloging its own achievement. The seeking itself becomes the obstacle. This stands as perhaps the cruelest joke in the spiritual marketplace. Every technique offered, every practice prescribed, every map drawn of higher consciousness, all risk feeding the very structure they claim to dissolve. The ego takes the tools meant for its transcendence and fashions from them a fortress. The ancient Chinese sages had a phrase for this recognition: Wu Wei. Usually translated as non-doing or effortless action, it points toward a way of being that confounds the Western mind raised on Protestant work ethic and self-improvement ideology. Wu Wei does not mean passivity, does not counsel laziness or withdrawal. Rather, it describes action aligned with the Tao, with the fundamental nature of reality, flowing like water finding its course rather than forcing against the grain of existence. The Tao Te Ching states, "The softest things in the world overcome the hardest things." Water wears away stone not through force, but through patient, persistent yielding. The more you grasp for spiritual attainment, the more violently you push toward transformation, the more surely it eludes you. Force creates counterforce, grasping creates slippage, the fist closes on air. Another passage cuts even deeper. In pursuit of knowledge, every day something is added. In the practice of the Tao, every day something is dropped. For many, this may seem counterintuitive. The spiritual path does not involve accumulation, but subtraction, not learning, but unlearning, not becoming, but discovering what remains when false becoming ceases. The sage grows lighter, not heavier. They shed concepts like autumn leaves, stand progressively more naked before reality until only presence remains. This teaching strikes at the root of all our educational conditioning, all our cultural narratives of progress through effort. We build resumes of spiritual accomplishment when we should be erasing names from the roster of self. We add practices when we should be dropping pretenses. The Taoist laughs at our intensity and points to the tree, which achieves its full height through yielding to its nature, not through willful striving to be taller. The Zen tradition takes this recognition and sharpens it to a blade that cuts through every spiritual fantasy. They teach the concept of mushotoku, meaning without gaining mind, without goal, or to act without seeking a reward, result, or external benefit, such as enlightenment. Dogen, often regarded as the most profound of Zen masters, taught something that sounds like madness to the achieving mind. Practice and enlightenment are one, not separate. You do not practice in order to achieve enlightenment. The practice itself is enlightenment when done with mushotoku, without the gaining mind. If you cannot find the truth right where you are, where else do you expect to find it? Dogen asks this question and the student's world collapses. There is nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, no future state to attain. The truth you seek inhabits this very moment, this breath, this ordinary awareness listening to these words. To look elsewhere for it guarantees its absence. Zen literature overflows with stories of breakthrough occurring precisely when students stopped trying, when they gave up entirely, when exhaustion or despair or simple forgetting dissolved the apparatus of seeking. The monk sweeps the garden and a pebble strikes bamboo, sudden awakening. Another sits in such complete frustration that the whole project of enlightenment falls away, immediate recognition. These stories are not accidents or coincidences. They reveal the structure of awakening itself. The trying prevents the finding. The cessation of trying opens the gate. Dogen elaborates, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. First, you study the nature of awakening. Then this study turns inward, becoming an investigation of your own consciousness, your own nature. But this studying cannot remain as effort, as a project. The self that studies must itself be forgotten, must dissolve in the act of investigation. And in that forgetting, enlightenment arrives not as achievement, but as revelation. The 10,000 things enlighten you. Reality itself becomes the teacher when the student stops trying to learn. The non-dual teaching of Advaita Vedanta pushes this recognition to its ultimate conclusion. Ramana Maharshi, perhaps the most luminous teacher of the 20th century, sat in silence and pointed followers towards self-inquiry. Who am I? This question, held with genuine intensity, dissolves the questioner. The one who seeks enlightenment is itself the primary illusion. Remove the illusion, and enlightenment stands revealed as your own nature, always present, never absent, requiring nothing to complete it. Nisargadatta Maharaj, the fierce sage from the streets of Mumbai, taught with even more directness. You already are what you seek. The enlightenment you pursue is your own being, prior to thought, prior to identification, prior to the story of yourself as separate seeker questioning for union. The ego's effort to become enlightened constitutes the core problem. An illusion cannot achieve reality. The mirage cannot make itself into water. Wisdom tells me I am nothing. Love tells me I am everything. Between these two recognitions lies the truth. You are nothing in the sense that the separate self you take yourself to be has no ultimate reality. It is a pattern of thought and memory with no substantial existence. You are everything in the sense that your true nature is consciousness itself, the awareness in which all experience arises. Not your personal consciousness, but consciousness as such, the space of knowing that precedes and contains all phenomena. This teaching sounds like philosophy, like abstract metaphysics, until it becomes living recognition. The shift happens not through more thinking, but through seeing through thought itself, through resting as the awareness that witnesses thought without being captured by it. Every spiritual practice in Advaita aims at this recognition, yet the recognition itself cannot be produced by practice. It reveals what was already the case. The Islamic Sufi mystics speak a language soaked in divine love and spiritual intoxication. They use the word fana, meaning annihilation, the death that precedes real life, the delusion of the separate self into the ocean of divine reality. The Sufis understand that the ego cannot gradually improve its way into union with God. The distance between creature and creator cannot be bridged by accumulating virtue or knowledge. Something must die. The self must be annihilated, not perfected. But here appears another layer of the paradox. This annihilation cannot be achieved through willpower, cannot be forced through ascetic intensity or spiritual ambition. The very effort to destroy the ego strengthens it, gives it new purpose, new identity as one who is annihilating the ego. The Sufis teach taslim, surrender, submission, yielding to divine will. Not the surrender that comes from defeat, but the surrender that recognizes its own powerlessness from the beginning. Rumi, the most spiritually intoxicated of mystics, poured out poetry that circles this truth from every angle. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. The treasure already exists within you. God already loves you, already calls you, already waits in the depth of your being. The work involves removing obstacles, not building bridges. You dismantle walls, not construct ladders to heaven. This shifts everything. The spiritual path becomes archaeological rather than architectural. You excavate rather than build, strip away rather than add on, remember rather than learn. The barriers you have built, these are the thought patterns that insist on your separation, the habitual contractions that maintain the illusion of isolated selfhood, the stories you tell about who you are and what you lack. Beneath all these barriers, love already flows, God already speaks, the divine presence already pervades your existence. The Sufi path winds through stations and states, through discipline and devotion, through prayer and practice. Yet all of this serves only to exhaust the seeker, to bring them to the point of complete surrender, where they can no longer maintain the illusion of being the doer, the achiever, the one climbing toward God. In that moment of utter surrender, fauna occurs. The drop dissolves in the ocean. The wave recognizes itself as water. The separation that never truly existed stands revealed as hallucination. Christianity, so often reduced to moral codes and theological propositions, harbors in its mystical stream the same recognition. The Quietists taught complete abandonment to divine will, a passive receptivity that scandalized the institutional church. How dare they suggest that human effort contributes nothing to salvation? How dare they counsel surrender rather than striving? Yet these mystics had tasted something beyond doctrine, had discovered through direct experience that God acts in the soul precisely when the soul ceases its frantic activity. Meister Eckhart, the dangerous mystic of medieval Christianity, coined the term Gelassenheit, releasement, letting go, a state beyond both action and inaction. One must become empty, Eckhart taught, detached from all things, even from desire for God. This final detachment scandalized his contemporaries. Surely we must desire God. Surely spiritual life involves cultivating holy longing. But Eckhart saw deeper. Even desire for God can be ego's territory, be the self's project of securing its own salvation. True emptiness requires releasing even that desire, standing naked before reality without agenda or goal. St. John of the Cross described this in his Doctrine of the Dark Night. God strips the soul of all spiritual consolations, removes every felt sense of divine presence, plunges the seeker into darkness so complete that even faith seems to vanish. Why this cruelty? Because the soul was clinging to its spiritual experiences. It was using God as an object for its own satisfaction. The dark night removes everything the ego can grasp, including and especially spiritual gifts. In that utter desolation, even the memory of God's presence fades. The soul finally releases its grip. And in that release, union happens beyond all experience or feeling. The Gospel of Thomas, a strange but powerful text hovering at Christianity's canonical edge, contains a saying that encapsulates this paradox. Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished. Here we see the seeking continues. It drives you forward, but the finding brings trouble because what you find contradicts everything the seeking assumed. The trouble arises from recognizing that seeking itself created the distance, that the effort maintained the separation. This recognition troubles the very foundation of the seeker's identity. Beyond the trouble lies astonishment, the wonder of discovering what was never absent. An anonymous English mystic of the 14th century wrote a text that bears one of the most evocative titles in Christian literature, The Cloud of Unknowing. God cannot be reached through intellectual effort, cannot be captured by imagining divine attributes or meditating on scripture. Between the soul and God hangs a cloud, a darkness, a knowing ignorance that must be entered rather than dispersed. This darkness and this cloud is always between you and your God, no matter what you do, and it prevents you from seeing him clearly by the light of understanding in your reason, and from experiencing him in sweetness of love in your affection. So set yourself to rest in this darkness as long as you can, always crying out after him whom you love. Rest in the darkness. This counsel reverses every instinct of the spiritual seeker who wants clarity, wants light, wants certainty, and felt experience of divine presence. The author describes a state where the will remains directed toward God, but without conceptual grasping, without the mind's attempt to understand or visualize. You reach toward what cannot be grasped, long for what cannot be imagined, love what cannot be comprehended. This is learned ignorance, the wisdom that knows it cannot know, the understanding that abandons understanding. The cloud appears not as an obstacle, but as the nature of ultimate reality itself. God dwells in darkness, in mystery, in the space beyond all human categories and concepts. The mystic must enter this cloud, must abandon the desire for spiritual experiences that can be named and claimed, must rest in darkness that offers nothing to the achieving mind. Here again surfaces the paradox. You cannot force entry into the cloud. You cannot make yourself unknowing through effort. The cloud opens only to the one who has exhausted effort, who rests in yearning without grasping. So many traditions call us to return to silence, not merely the absence of sound, not simple quietness of voice, but a profound stillness that penetrates beneath the surface of consciousness itself. Silence or inner stillness holds a unique position among spiritual practices because it naturally dissolves the achieving mind. You cannot grasp silence. You cannot accumulate it like merit or display it like attainment. Silence receives rather than grasps, opens rather than conquers, yields rather than forces. Watch what happens in genuine silence. The mind, habituated to constant activity, initially rebels. It generates thoughts, plans, memories, fantasies, anything to fill the void. The rebellion reveals the ego's terror of its own disillusion. The mind fears silence because silence threatens the mind's sovereignty, its claim to be the center and substance of your being. But if you remain with silence, if you neither fight the thoughts nor follow them, something shifts. The thoughts continue, but you recognize yourself as the space in which thoughts arise. This represents a state of being rather than doing. Every other spiritual practice can be corrupted by effort, can be seized by the achieving mind and transformed into a project. You can make meditation into performance, prayer into petition, study into accumulation. But silence, true silence, refuses this corruption. The moment you try to achieve silence, to grasp it or measure it, or claim it as attainment, you have already departed from silence itself. Silence only opens to the one who stops trying to open it. Meister Eckhart understood this when he declared, "Nothing in all creation is so like God as silence. Not love, though love is divine. Not light, though God is called light. Not wisdom or power or presence. Silence. Because silence participates in the nature of God as mystery, as the void pregnant with all potential, as the darkness that precedes and contains all light. The soul must long for God in silence," Eckhart taught. The longing continues, but it must be silent longing, yearning without words, desire without object, reaching without grasping. The Gnostic texts speak of silence in ways that suggest mystical experience rather than theological speculation. The Gospel of Mary describes silence as a primordial state, a divine realm that exists before and beyond all manifestation. Silence came forth, the text declares, personifying silence as an active principle, as generative power. From silence comes the release. You are released, go onwards. Liberation emerges from silence, not from knowledge or practice or moral perfection. This silence transcends mere absence of speech. The Gnostics understood it as a realm beyond conceptual thought itself, beyond the categories and divisions that structure ordinary consciousness. You cannot think your way into silence. Thought, by its nature, creates distinctions, separates subject from object, divides reality into pieces. Silence precedes this division, inhabits the space before thought carves up the seamless whole into fragments. The Gospel of Truth describes silence as the realm of the Father, the undifferentiated source from which all manifestation emerges. Before the Word, before creation, before multiplicity, there dwells silence. Not empty silence, but pregnant silence. Silence containing infinite potential, silence as womb of all that is. The Gnostic cosmology often describes creation as a fall from this original silence into speech, into naming, into the fragmentation of the one into the many. Salvation involves return, a journey back through the levels of reality to the primordial silence. This teaching sounds abstract until you taste it in meditation, in the gaps between thoughts, in the moments when the constant internal dialogue suddenly stops. For an instant, you touch something prior to thought, a presence or awareness that needs no words, no concepts, no explanation. That instant opens a door to what the Gnostics called the pleroma, the fullness, the divine realm of silence and light. The Corpus Hermeticum, the enigmatic texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, emphasize silence as precondition for divine revelation. In the Poimandres, the first and most influential tractate, Hermes must first become silent and empty his mind before the vision of the divine mind appears. Silence is the beginning of the purification of the soul, the text declares. Not study, not ritual, not moral discipline, though these may have their place. Silence comes first, creating the condition for revelation. The pattern repeats throughout the Hermetic literature. The seeker asks for wisdom and the divine voice responds, first become silent. The mind, full of chatter, of questions and desires and plans, cannot receive the transmission. Like a radio tuned into multiple frequencies simultaneously, it hears only noise. Silence tunes the receiver, clears the channel, creates space for the signal to come through. In the discourse on the 8th and 9th, a dialogue between master and disciple, the master at the crucial moment commands, "Now, my son, be silent, for from now on it is not fitting to speak." The teaching transcends words. The ultimate revelation cannot be conveyed through language, cannot be captured in concepts. Master and disciple enter together into silence, and in that shared silence, direct transmission occurs. The disciple receives not information but transformation, not knowledge about reality but participation in it. The Asclepius, another Hermetic text, declares that the highest divine reality dwells beyond all names and remains forever unnameable. Every name limits, defines, and separates the named from the unnamed. But God, the source, the ultimate reality, cannot be contained by definition or captured by naming. The text speaks of the silence of the Father, describing this not as absence, but as undifferentiated unity from which all creation emerges. This silence is infinitely alive. The Hermetic mystic seeks to return attention to this primordial silence, to rest in the space before naming and knowing, to touch the source directly rather than contemplating its reflections in creation. The Rosicrucian tradition, emerging from the mystical ferment of early modern Europe, incorporated this understanding of silence into its practices and teachings. The aspirant must cultivate inner silence as a prerequisite for spiritual communion, for reception of higher knowledge. The visible world operates through sound, through vibration, through the world that shapes matter. But the invisible world, the realm of spiritual reality, communicates through silence, through direct knowing that bypasses language. The Rosicrucian adept learns to quiet not merely outer speech, but inner dialogue, the constant stream of thought that normally dominates consciousness. In that quiet, other faculties awaken. Intuition and perception emerge from silence, cannot be forced or produced, but only received in states of profound receptivity. Long before Christianity or Hermeticism, the ancient Greeks understood the role of silence in mystical initiation. The Orphic mysteries required silence as part of the initiatory process. The candidate underwent experiences designed to shatter ordinary consciousness, to reveal dimensions of hidden reality from everyday awareness. But these divine truths could not be apprehended through direct experience, could not be spoken, could not be reduced to doctrine or teaching. The Pythagoreans took this practice to extremes, reportedly requiring periods of silence lasting up to 5 years as part of initiation into their school. This was not arbitrary discipline. Pythagoras recognized that ordinary consciousness operates through constant mental and verbal noise. The student's mind, full of opinions and questions and chatter, cannot receive the deeper teachings. Silence serves as a way to cultivate inner listening, to develop the capacity for wisdom rather than mere knowledge. The Eastern Orthodox tradition developed its own path to silence through hesychasm, a practice whose very name derives from the Greek hesychia, quietness, stillness, tranquility. The hesychas, monks primarily of Mount Athos in the Byzantine world, pursued inner stillness through the Jesus prayer, through breath control, through postures designed to draw attention inward and downward into the heart. But hesychasm involves more than technique. At its core lies the recognition that the divine presence cannot be grasped through theological reasoning or liturgical correctness alone. God must be experienced directly, must be encountered in the depths of consciousness where words fail. The hesychas quiets the mind to experience divine presence without mediation, without the interference of conceptual thought. This practice creates a paradoxical state, attentive relaxation, vigilant receptivity, a condition simultaneously awake and still. The hesychas remains alert, guards against distraction and delusion, maintains intense focus. Yet this alertness does not involve tension or grasping. Rather, the practitioner rests in openness, in availability to grace. They cannot force divine presence to manifest. They can only prepare, wait, remain open. The hesychas fathers warned against spiritual ambition, against seeking visions or extraordinary experiences. Such seeking invites delusion, opens the door to demonic deception. The true hesychas desires only God, only the simple awareness of divine presence. If visions come, they are received without grasping. If darkness comes, it is endured without despair. The practice cannot guarantee results because divine grace operates according to its own logic, not as reward for human effort. Here again the paradox appears. You must practice with dedication, with discipline, with unwavering commitment, yet the practice itself cannot produce the goal. The hesychas works while knowing that only grace brings transformation. They till the soil, but cannot make the seed grow. The Their silence creates conditions but cannot command the divine to speak. The Hindu tradition names this practice Mauna, deliberate silence, the discipline of restraining speech to cultivate inner awareness. But Mauna extends beyond refraining from talking. It involves silencing the inner commentary, the constant mental narration that interprets and judges every experience. The practitioner of Mauna seeks to rest in awareness itself, prior to the mind's categorization of reality into subject and object, pleasant and unpleasant, desired and rejected. The Upanishads, the ancient philosophical texts that form the foundation of Vedantic thought, declare that Brahman, the ultimate reality, exists beyond words. Language can point toward Brahman, but can never capture it. Every description proves inadequate, every concept too narrow. The famous phrase, neti neti, emerges from this recognition, not this, not that. You can only approach Brahman through negation, through stripping away false identifications and limiting concepts until only silence remains. Ramana Maharshi, as mentioned earlier, taught primarily through silence. Seekers came from around the world to sit in his presence, and often he would say nothing, would simply rest in his own being while they sat with him. Those who were ready received transmission in that silence, understood through wordless knowing what volumes of scripture could not convey. Silence is the most potent form of work, Ramana declared. However vast and emphatic the scriptures may be, they fail in their effect. The guru is quiet and peace prevails in all. His silence is more vast and more emphatic than all the scriptures put together. This statement overturns every assumption about teaching and learning, about spiritual transmission and instruction. The greatest teaching involves no words, no concepts, no explanation. The realized being simply is, and that being itself communicates truth to those capable of receiving it. Silence is unceasing eloquence. It is the best language. Ramana spoke these words, and they carry a weight beyond philosophy. Silence speaks what words cannot. In the presence of genuine silence, of consciousness resting in itself without agitation or grasping, something transmits itself without transmission, teaches without teaching, transforms without technique. Buddhism, particularly in its meditation traditions, emphasizes what is called noble silence, the quietness that supports mindfulness and insight. It points toward the recognition that the concepts and labels we impose on reality create the very problems we seek to escape. The mind chatters constantly, naming, judging, comparing, creating stories about experience. This mental noise obscures the direct perception of reality as it is. The doctrine of sunyata, emptiness, describes reality as fundamentally beyond conceptual elaboration. Things exist, experience happens, but the nature of existence cannot be captured by thought or fixed by language. Every concept we apply to reality proves empty when examined closely, revealing itself as mental construction rather than intrinsic property. Silence allows this emptiness to be experienced directly, not as nihilistic void, but as openness, as freedom from the prison of conceptual fixation. The Buddhist practitioner learns to observe thoughts without identifying with them, to watch the mind's constant activity from a position of spacious awareness. In that observation, gaps appear between thoughts. These moments expand with practice until the meditator can rest in awareness itself, in the silence that contains all experience without being disturbed by it. Look beneath the surface of these diverse traditions and a pattern emerges. Silence appears not as technique among others, but as the primordial ground from which all manifestation arises. Before thought, before speech, before the cosmos organized itself into particular forms, there existed silence. Not void as absence, but silence as infinite potential, as the undifferentiated unity that precedes division. Every mystical tradition has a language for this recognition. The Tao that cannot be named, the Brahman beyond attributes, Buddhist Sunyata, different words pointing toward the same reality, the ground of being that exists prior to all phenomena, the source from which the 10,000 things emerge and to which they return. The mystic seeks to return attention to this source, to touch the silence that precedes and contains all words, all thoughts, all experiences. Not to escape manifestation, but to recognize the ground from which forms arise. When you rest in that recognition, you participate in the creative power of the source itself. The traditions describe a systematic stripping away of concepts and words. The Christian mystics called it the via negativa, approaching God not by saying what God is, but by removing everything God is not. Layer by layer, the concepts fall away until only unknowing remains. This negation culminates in silence. At the summit of mystical ascent, beyond all words and concepts, you encounter the generative silence that contains all potential. The paradox resolves. The journey was necessary, yet the destination was present from the beginning. The climbing brought you to the recognition that you never left the summit. The following Zen saying cuts through every spiritual fantasy. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities remain the same, yet everything has changed. Before you chop wood while lost in thought, maintaining the constant mental commentary that separates you from direct experience. After you chop wood, simply, completely, without the overlay of conceptual mind, the activity and the awareness merge. This teaching demolishes promises of transcendence into higher realms. Enlightenment reveals the sacredness of here, the perfection of now. The wood you chop becomes a gateway to the infinite, the release of grasping. This is the transformation. The mystical traditions, separated by centuries and continents, converge on this truth. What you seek cannot be grasped through seeking. What you desire to become, you already are. Silence emerges not as technique among techniques, but as a doorway to this recognition. Not because silence produces enlightenment, but because silence is the space where the illusion of separation naturally dissolves. The ancient teachers were describing direct experience, but this releasement from ambitious seeking proves nearly impossible for consciousness conditioned to equate worth with achievement. We have built entire industries around spiritual seeking, all promising to deliver what already saturates your existence. But all of this only serves to distract you from realizing the truth. Your fundamental nature is already complete. Yet this declaration creates its own danger. The ego can seize even this teaching. I must realize my true nature. I must awaken to what I already am. Silence cuts through this trap because it cannot be made into a project without ceasing to be silent. Consider what happens in genuine silence. The internal dialogue stops. In that cessation, what remains? Awareness itself, consciousness without object, presence without content. You recognize yourself as this awareness, as the space in which all experience arises. This recognition does not require years of practice. It requires only the willingness to stop, to rest in what you are before you claim to tell yourself who you should become. And then, in some moment that cannot be predicted, the structure collapses, the seeking stops, The grasping releases. The silence you have been cultivating reveals itself not as something you achieved, but as what you are, what you have always been. In that moment, nothing changes and everything transforms. Life continues with its ordinary tasks, but you are no longer the separate self struggling against existence. You are silence itself, aware and present, witnessing the dance of phenomena without being caught in identification. The mystics knew. They emphasized silence not to make things difficult, but because silence alone could not be corrupted by the achieving mind. They understood that the ultimate teaching must be wordless, that the deepest truth can only be transmitted in stillness. As the video comes to an end, listen to the following 30 seconds of silence and be still. Not seeking anything, but simply being what you are before thought defines you. You are already home. The silence knows this. Be still and know. Thank you so much for joining me. How did you feel in that bit of silence? Let me know in the comments. If you would like to support the channel, you can join my Patreon for just $5 per month and get early access to videos. For a one-time donation, there's a Ko-fi and PayPal link in the description and pinned in the comments, but the easiest way to support is just to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a future video. Check out my website, Oculus.com, and the other history channel I narrate for called Folks of Yore. Again, thank you so much for watching. Until next time.